You know what's crazy? The fact that an Irish Celtic pagan goddess meant to represent family and magic was taken and transformed into a Catholic saint, and even later on was adopted by slaves to become Queen of the Dead. I'm not kidding, this actually happened. But how, you may ask? Well, it's a long story going over 1,000 years, and to understand it, we need to understand what happens when religions merge. Now, to a Western mind, religions merging may sound very weird, but it's actually kind of common. It's the reason why the Olympians have two sets of names. It's also the whole reason voodoo exists, but I'll touch on that more later. Syncretism is a natural consequence of people exchanging ideas and thoughts. Why do Christians all over the world celebrate their Savior's birthday by giving gifts to each other? Because when Christianity first spread across Rome, the Romans wanted to keep some old pagan traditions, so they compromised and combined some Christian and pagan traditions together to create Christmas. Note, that isn't to say Christmas is pagan, it just has some pagan elements, but the holiday as a whole still is Christian at its core. Syncretism in its simplest definition is the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, and schools of thought. We only care about the religious part though. In the ancient world, syncretism was very common and widely accepted. The Greeks and the Egyptians constantly exchanged and worshipped each other's gods as a way to maintain good relations and trade. And as mentioned earlier, the Romans absorbed the entire Greek pantheon into their own religion, and that became the dominant religion in Rome. In fact, wherever the Romans went, they absorbed other gods. The Romans were very superstitious and believed all gods were real, but theirs were just the strongest. In the early Middle East, syncretism was commonplace too. The Mesopotamians and Jews both have flood stories that are believed to be related in some way. And speaking of the Jews, they took from some of their neighboring tribes' gods and made them into demons who allied with Satan against the god of the Jews, Yahweh. So as you can see, syncretism was the norm for centuries, and this is only around the Mediterranean. Things started to change though when two religions popped up onto the scene, Christianity and Islam. These two are exclusionary religions who believe they have a monopoly on truth, and as a result, syncretism is a big no-no to them. Now you could argue that Judaism fits in along with these two, but if you look at some early Hebrew text, you can see that Yahweh is just one of many gods. Yahweh is just the strongest god in existence. Even though Islam and Christianity are exclusionary religions, if you want your local cult to make it big, sacrifices gotta be made. In Christianity, this meant bringing in some holidays, but also minor details like angels looking like cherubs. Meanwhile, in Islam, it meant incorporating the jinn. Jinns are pre-Islamic Arabian trickster spirits who aren't present in Judaism or Christianity, but they are in Islam, so it's very likely that they were syncretized into Islam from a polytheistic pre-Islamic Arabian religion. So now that we know what syncretism is it a good or a bad thing? As you can imagine, this is a highly controversial question in today's world, especially in churches. Many people who identify themselves as Christian, if you ask them what they thought of syncretism, well, at first they'd probably say, "What's syncretism?" But then, once you explain, they would probably say it's heresy, and that it's an ancient practice which has long since been abandoned. But the thing is, syncretism can't be abandoned because it's a natural consequence of cultures interacting and exchanging ideas. When European missionaries came to America, some of them, Catholics especially, would learn the native language and then translate the Bible into that language. Oversimplification of Native American religions, they often had either a central figure hero or a great creator spirit in that religion, and that hero/creator spirit's name would be used to translate the word God. As an admittedly unintentional result, Native Americans merged their religion with Christianity. They kept their spirits and legends while at the same time attended Mass on Sunday. This happened as recently as the 1800s, and while US manifest destinied their way across the continent, syncretism continued to happen, admittedly unintentionally. Syncretism still happens today with movements like pantheism and omnitheism, which are the belief that all gods are real, and you can choose which god you worship. Probably one of the coolest things about syncretism is that it creates things people would never have imagined being possible. A great example of this is voodoo. Now voodoo deserves a video all of its own, so for now I'm just gonna explain some quick knowledge about its origin. Voodoo formed during the transatlantic slave trade when West Africans were brought into the Caribbean and the American South. In the Caribbean, the plantation owners were majority Catholic and they wanted their slaves to convert. These people weren't too thrilled with the idea of giving up their own religions though, so they still practiced them in private. As time went on though, those old African traditions started to blend and merge with Catholicism. Africans weren't the only slaves though. Native Americans, though few in number, were enslaved as well, and they brought some of their own traditions into the mix. A few generations of mixing later, and you got a whole new religion made of African, Catholic, and Native American beliefs: Voodoo. Keep in mind what I'm about to say is a vast oversimplification. I'm trying to describe Voodoo in a paragraph, so give me a break. From Catholics, they have a concept of one god, Beyondai. There are also lesser deities though, called Lolas, and similarly to Kami, they're often translated as God with a lowercase g, but a better translation would be powerful spirit. These Loas are kinda like your traditional pantheon of Greeks, Norse, and Egyptian gods. But here's the crazy thing though. A lot of Lolas are really just Catholic saints in disguise. Not all of them, but a lot of them. The slaves took the saints from the Catholic Church and syncretized them with African and Native American gods, and as a result, Voodoo became a thing. Bear in mind though, this didn't happen overnight. It was a long process that took a few generations. Plus, Voodoo is so different because of all the different islands and locations the slaves came from and lived in during the Atlantic slave trade. Like I said, I'm trying to summarize a few centuries into a paragraph. Ever since I mentioned Voodoo, I bet someone was waiting for me to talk about Baron Samedi. And while he is a ton of fun to talk about, I think his wife has a much more interesting story. This is the goddess I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Unfortunately, this script is already getting pretty long, so I'm going to cut it into 2 parts. In the next part, we're going to talk about Bridget and her story from goddess to saint and back to a goddess. Part 2 will be out in March between St. Patrick's Day and International Women's Day. Until then, thank you for watching, leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you want to see more, and have a good one.